spent a lot of time searching for who had written a lot about this whole issue of deglobalization and so forth. And we're very privileged to have two really prolific writers and thinkers on this issue. I'm going to give you a brief description of their bios. And I'm sorry we were a little late, but I hope that gave you some time to have some initial coffee, right, where you are. But let me just tell you about our two debaters. The first is Professor Walden Bello. He is currently an international adjunct professor of sociology at the State University of New York at Binghamton, and senior visiting research fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies University, co-chair of the Bangkok-based Research and Advocacy Institute focus on the Global South. Can you hear me a little better? Okay. He has written very regularly about deglobalization over a very, very long period of time. You know what position he's taking. He's going to be taking the position that deglobalization is inevitable. He's written a lot about that, and he'll explain his point of view during the debate. He is a co-author of 25 books, and actually, he was the phrase deglobalization in 2011, I guess, 2001. So that's part of the reason why I have. But he has BA from Binghamton University and a PhD in sociology from Princeton University. Edward Ashbee is a professor in the Department of International Economics, Government and Business at Copenhagen Business School. So these two debaters are not geographically where they're supposed to be. He's supposed to be in Copenhagen. His books include a book that was published last fall on deglobalization, which I highly recommend. But he's also written a lot of books regarding China, Belt and Road, U.S. politics, and he was recently appointed to be Danish head of the educational program for public management and social development. So we have two really prolific writers on this topic, very passionate about their positions, which we're about to find out. And in terms of the structure of this, we're going to basically follow a traditional debate format. So what we're going to do is each of them will have 8 minutes to give their opening statements, and I'll give them they've asked me to give them a 2-minute warning. When they're getting closer to the end of their 8 minutes. Then there'll be a rebuttal, and each one will give the rebut the other's position for 5 minutes. We might have a discussion after that, but we're going to end closing statements by each of them 5 minutes. So this is going to be very, very interesting. So we'll switch. Eddie, heads or tails? And I'm going to flip the coin.
I'll go for heads.
Heads. Heads it is. Okay. So our first opening statement, Eddie, it's your fault because you called heads. It is heads. So you have 8 minutes to do your opening statement.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Peter. I didn't hear all of your introduction because of audio challenges, but I'm going to assume it was fairly kind. So thank you very much. It's probably sensible to begin with a definition or two. There are, of course, enough definitions of globalization to fill a medium-sized sports arena. So I'm going to content myself with this, and this ties in, I think, with some of the comments made by Professor Stiglitz. I understand globalization to be the lowering of national borders so as to facilitate more economic exchanges, cultural exchanges, social exchanges, and of course, political exchanges. And it follows from that if we're going to talk, as we are this evening, about deglobalization, then we're saying those processes, which we might want to date from the 1970s, we might want to date from the 1990s, those processes are currently being thrown into reverse gear, and as a result of that, will reverse themselves over the coming decades more fully. Now, having said that, I'm going to argue in good traditional debating style against the motion. That doesn't mean that I'm saying it's going to be business as usual. I am not for a moment arguing that what began in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s is just continuing in the way that it has hitherto. So there are going to be and significant changes, and indeed significant changes are taking place. Now, I need to show that I am, of course, a fully paid up social scientist. So instead of using fairly straightforward words, I'm going to throw in more complicated words and try and earn my salary. I'm going to be arguing that the world is heading towards what might be termed very pretentiously a variegated regime, What we are seeing is a whole mixture of things. Globalization, slowbalization, deglobalization, decoupling, recoupling, de-risking, risking, all happening at broadly one and the same time if we survey the globe. Some of you may remember a movie that came out 3 or 4 years ago called Everything Everywhere All at Once, a series of parallel universes. And in a sense, I'm arguing that the world is moving towards something that represents was represented by that movie. In other words, if I want to put it in ordinary pub English rather than the rarefied jargon of the social sciences, I'm saying the world is becoming an increasingly messy place. Now, let me argue my case. Those who talk about deglobalization and the fate of globalization usually point, and Professor Stiglitz pointed to some of these, to a chain of events. They point to the great financial crisis of 2008. They then usually turn their attention to Brexit, Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. They will then say the word Trump. They will then turn to COVID. They then turn to Ukraine. They then say Trump again, and maybe Trump again one more time. I want to take just one of those points in the chain, one of those links in the chain, and concentrate on Brexit, Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. And Britain is, of course, my original country. As is fairly well known, in 2016, Britain voted by a relatively narrow majority for a divorce from the European Union. Like many a divorce, there were promises that everybody would remain good friends, but the implementation of the divorce was pretty rough going, pretty abrasively fought, and talk of a soft Brexit was quickly junked in favour of what became known as a hard Brexit. Now, the consequences of that are worth charting. Certainly, if we take the bigger companies, if, for example, living in Denmark, I order something from Amazon UK, they can get by. They have got armies of lawyers and accountants. They can set up subsidiaries in continental Europe, and all the bureaucratic regulations, all the taxes, all the administrative charges that are levied now for British goods being sent into the European Union can partly be absorbed and partly be passed on to the consumer. So Mr. Bezos is doing okay. Small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, on the other hand, have faced major challenges, and the British economy has been significantly affected. Trade is estimated, and I don't think these estimates are really the subject of contention. Trade is now 15% lower on a permanent basis. And we can also say that productivity, efficiency has been hit by the absence of competition. That in turn, of course, means lost jobs and lost employment. Britain, if you visit many a particularly northern British city, you can see a lot of evidence of that. Now, up to now, that sounds like deglobalization, breaking the link.
2-minute warning. That's my instruction.
Thank you, Peter. And so Britain is looking in quite a rough way, but it's more complicated than that. There were references earlier to the service sector. In many ways, the service sector has survived. Britain is still getting a fair bit of foreign direct investment. So in other words, what we've got is that mixture, that variegated regime that I talked about a few minutes ago. Deglobalization is happening, but alongside deglobalization, we've got other moves, we've got other shifts. Parts of the service sector have perhaps shown themselves more movable than might have been expected. Now, I'm open to the charge, very open to the charge at this point, that I'm concentrating on the global north, I'm concentrating on the more privileged countries. But I'm sitting here just outside Beijing at the moment, and I think I'm very aware of the extent to which globalization, or at least globalizing processes, are taking place in this part of the world, whether it's under the banner of China's Belt and Road Initiative, or whether it's happening more privately and discreetly. Trade is increasing, investment is increasing, economic exchanges are increasing, particularly if we look across to Southeast Asia. In other words, we are heading towards a world where processes are taking place in multiple directions, at multiple speeds, in multiple ways. And what I would say by way of a conclusion is that we tend to live by different catchphrases. Those with long memories will remember the end of history, or the world's a village, or with even longer memories, we're all Keynesians now. But all these catchphrases, all these buzzwords have a fairly limited shelf life. Deglobalization, likewise, will have a limited shelf life. Thank you, Peter.
You're exactly 2 seconds over 8 minutes. Well done, Eddie. So, Walden, it's your turn.
Okay, thanks, Eddie, and thanks, Peter, and to the two organizations for inviting me to speak today. Let me say at the outset that when I say deglobalization is inevitable, I really mean in the short and medium term. I really prefer not to address the long term, not only because the long term is the specialty of crystal ball gazers, but also because, as my favorite thinker, John Maynard Keynes, put it, and I quote, "In the long run, we are all dead," unquote. Now, in the 1990s, we were told that we were entering an era known as globalization, that owing to free trade and unobstructed capital flows in a borderless global economy would lead to the best of all possible worlds. Most of the West's economic, political, and intellectual elites bought into this vision. I still remember how the venerable Thomas Friedman of the New York Times lampooned those of us who resisted this vision as, quote, flat earthers, unquote, or believers in a flat earth. 30 years on, I take no pride in having been one of those who discerned the mess we are in today, to which unfettered globalization has been a central contributor. The highest rates of inequality in decades, growing poverty in both the global north and the global south, deindustrialization in the United States and many other countries, massive indebtedness of consumers in the global north and whole countries in the global south, financial crisis after financial crisis, the rise of the far right, and intensifying geopolitical conflict. Globalization did not lead to a new world order, but to the brave new world. In the 2000s, Apple led the escape away from the confines of the national economy to create global supply chains propped up by cheap labor. Now, Apple is leading the return of the prodigals, among them US chip makers Intel and NVIDIA, automotive leader Tesla, and pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson, and hot on their heels in relocating their supply lines in the United States are big names, foreign name brands such as Hyundai Motors, Honda, Samsung, TSMC, and pharmaceutical firm Sanofi. Now, all of these firms admit that the move to North America will be hugely disruptive in terms of access to cheap labor and workers with manufacturing know-how. But they have no choice. The rationale, as Apple CEO Tim Cook put it in a recent interview, and I quote, "The president has said he wants more in the United States, so we want more in the United States," unquote. But make no mistakes, these are strategic moves. The tremendous global anger and resentment at the dystopia to which corporate-driven globalization has led us is perhaps the biggest reason why deglobalization will be the trend for a long, long while. In other words, the politics of rage, not the economics of narrow efficiency in the service of corporate profitability, is now in command. In the United States, globalization created two antagonistic communities. One that benefited from it due to their superior education and incomes, the other that suffered from it owing to their lack of both economic and educational advantages. The latter is the vast sector of the population that Yale Club member Hillary Clinton called, quote, "the deplorables," unquote, but is better known as the Make America Great Again crowd. That community will not easily forget either the sufferings brought about by the deindustrialization spearheaded by Apple and other well-known TNCs, or the slights they endured from Hillary, whom they regard as being in the pocket of Wall Street. Second, the institutions of the multilateral order that serve as the political canopy or system of governance for free trade and unobstructed capital flows are either dead or dying, something that Professor Stiglitz referred to. The World Trade Organization, which was once described as the jewel in the crown of multilateralism, no longer functions as a system for governing world trade, largely owing to the sabotage by the United States. The International Monetary Fund has not recovered from its reputation of promoting austerity in developing countries, and its disastrous push for unfettered capital flows that brought down the so-called Asian tiger economies in 1997, also referred to by Professor Stiglitz. The World Bank also is discredited for its complicity in imposing austerity measures, as well as for the wrong-headed policy of export-oriented instead of domestic market-centered industrialization that the bank prescribed as the route to prosperity for developing countries, one that is now especially fatal for those that followed it, given the ultra-protectionism sweeping the United States. Third, national security, both economic and military, has displaced the desire for prosperity, for trade and investment as the principal force driving relations among countries. Both Biden and Trump banned advanced computer chips to China, and more such measures will follow. Reorganizing and regionalizing, if not nationalizing, access to supply lines for key resources for advanced technologies like lithium, rare earth, copper, cobalt, and nickel is now the overriding concern. The aim being not only to monopolize these commodities, but to prevent competitors from getting to them. Let me end by saying that the issue is not the inevitability of deglobalization, but what form deglobalization will take. Deglobalization marked by ultra-protectionism in trade relations, unilateralism and isolationism in economic and military relations, and the creation of a domestic market geared principally towards the interests of the racial and ethnic majority is one way to globalize. That is indeed where Trump is leading the United States. But there is another way to deglobalize, and this is what I envisioned in my book, Deglobalization, Ideas for a New World Economy 25 years ago. This is deglobalization that prioritizes the development and enhancement of the internal market, one that harnesses international market forces to build the capacity of the domestic economy instead of smashing it, as did corporate-driven globalization. Thank you very much.
So Walden beat budget by 37 seconds. So it's well done, both of you.
Thank you.
By the way, just a brief interruption. At the beginning, courtesy of all the traffic of the UN General Assembly this week, I didn't have the opportunity to introduce the new president of Committee 100, Paul Chung, who's over there, who was stuck in traffic when he started. But we're warm welcome. We're very excited about his joining and taking Committee 100 to new heights. So that's my brief halftime show, all right? So we have the two opening statements. It's very interesting. Clearly that our two debaters have a very different view of the world. And so now we're going to turn to the rebuttal. And I'm just going to arbitrarily say, you know, Eddie, I'm going to let you do the first rebuttal, and then Walden. And then for the final closing statements, we'll do Walden and then Eddie. So Eddie, you want to start the rebuttal, and you have 5 minutes.
Okay, I mean, thank you very much indeed to Walden for his comments. If the forces of deglobalization were led by Walden Bello, I would sleep very easily in my bed at night. Unfortunately, the reality is, of course, the forces of deglobalization, as Walden said in his comments, are not led by him or his co-thinkers, but led altogether by very, very different political forces. And I want to start my comments by agreeing with a significant part of what Walden said in his presentation. I mean, firstly, it's absolutely clear, and Joe Stiglitz touched on this as well, that there are huge sections of society, if we take the traditional industrial societies of Europe and North America, huge regions, huge constituencies within those regions that have been severely hit. Now, we can argue whether they've been severely hit by technology and regardless of globalization would have been severely hit, or whether it's globalization. It is clearly some mixture of the two, and we can argue with each other exactly about the ratios. But clearly there are regions in the US, we talk about the Rust Belt, in England, I would talk about the north of England and parts of Scotland. We can point to any country where the traditional working class, for want of a better term, has been very, very badly hit, and they will compare their own fate with the relative prosperity that their parents and grandparents seem to enjoy in relatively stable jobs. It's also the case that governments, Western governments, have been pitiful, absolutely pitiful, in their attempts to provide adjustment assistance, again, or whatever term is used, for those people who've been thrown out of work, those communities that have been decimated by the destruction of, let's say, the steel industry, the coal industry, and so on. And that has provided a fertile breeding ground for conservative, populist, and nationalist ideologies, which of course are growing apace. And so I agree absolutely with all that's been said. We can also throw into the mix, and Walden touched on this, and as did Professor Stiglitz, the fragility of current global supply chains. But all that having been said, we need to set that against the changes that have taken place during our lifetimes. All of us on the panel, I think, are of a certain age now, and we can look back over a considerable number of decades. And what has been remarkable in those decades is certainly the extent of global poverty, but also the extent to which large numbers have moved out of global poverty if we compare today with the 1960s. Clearly, in large parts, we're talking about developments within China and, to a lesser extent, perhaps developments within India. But they have propelled, and trade and exchange and economic rationality have propelled a significant level of growth that has moved important numbers out of poverty. And that, I think, we need to remember. And if we're drawing up a balance sheet of what has happened, it needs to be, in the immortal words of Fox News, fair and balanced. And that's what I'm trying to inject.
Thank you very much. So, Walden, your time to rebut Eddie's comments from his opening statement.
Okay, well, I think what Eddie was saying was that deglobalization was happening, but there were a number of other trends that were happening, and we're not exactly sure what is the mix that is going to take place. He compared this to the movie Everything, Everywhere at Once, which I think half of the world, found very entertaining, and half of the world hated. Okay, and the point there is, yes, these are all the different trends. But I did want to zero in on that very, very strong reaction to globalization that has taken place within the global north. And I think when you look at that, especially in the United States, now you have a president who can do anything he wants because he can basically say he has a base that supports the ultra protectionism and everything else that he's pushing. And this is, I think, very important when you have the world's biggest economy basically moving in a deglobalist direction, as Eddie has conceded, being led by Trump. That is extremely significant. And the other thing is the rest of the world has learned about how not to put everything in one basket. So I think there's a great deal of resentment, feelings about the globalization that has taken place. Inequality is now at its highest in years, in decades. The top 1% of the world owns half the global wealth, except maybe for China. A lot of different parts of the world haven't seen any improvements in poverty reduction. And indeed, China's growth even has affected and created deindustrialization in many countries, including Brazil. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we expect that many of these countries have learned from what has happened in globalization, and will now undertake processes by which they can protect their economies, unlike the way that they were left unprotected by a world led by the World Trade Organization. So I would say, therefore, that what we are looking at is a multipolar world where there will be multipolar associations, and countries will be basically joining those associations that give them the benefit or the opportunity to be able to develop themselves. And that, I think, is the kind of vision of deglobalization that I think is superior to the one that is being offered by Trump. So basically, therefore, I think Eddie has agreed with me in many ways, and I thank him for that. But I do think, and the difference between us is, I think, the trend of deglobalization is the predominant trend, rather than the other things everywhere happening at once with Michelle Chan. Thank you. Michelle, yo, sorry.
Of course, I have to ask you, did you like the film or not?
I hated the film.
You did? Oh. Well, we're not going to judge your debating expertise based on your cinematic taste. Now, we're going to enter now the final statements, and as a prerogative, my prerogative as a debate moderator, I'm going to ask the two debaters, and this is not a surprise because we had a prep session, that in your 5-minute closing arguments, I'd like you to address, at least for part of it, the following, which is the long-term historical perspective. Because both of you have talked about what you see as the current situation. Both of you have talked about where you think it's heading, whether it's deglobalization or not. But the reality is, if you look at globalization, it goes back for centuries. The Romans and so forth, the British Empire, and a lot of different factors affected. And there was always been true that countries have relatively different strengths. Africa was always going to be, on commodities, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'd like to do is, in your 5-minute finals closing statement, at least partially address this long-term history and whether you think there's any relevance to our current situation and where things might head. It would be very interesting to ask emperors of Rome what they thought about deglobalization many centuries ago, right? So with that, as promised, Walden, you get to go first this time with your closing arguments and your killer arguments before we all end up voting.
Yeah, well, I think we from the Global South, view the last 5 centuries as an ongoing, history of colonialism and hegemony by the North. And, this is the perspective that we bring to this issue. So that, yes, Western analysts may see periods of deglobalization followed by globalization and then, another shift. But for us, it's been a continuing history by which economies, whether under periods of deglobalization or globalization, have been subjected to the hegemony of the Western economies. It's an unbroken history of colonialism and neocolonialism after that. So I think that's the perspective that we bring. But but what I'd like to do is, with my opening statement, I just wanted to say, closing statement, what was the difference, or what is the difference that we have from Trump's deglobalization? Well, one is we do not propose a withdrawal into autarky, which is happening with Trump, but continued participation in the international economy, but in a way that ensures that instead of killing the internal market economy, international market forces are harnessed to assist in building capacity to sustain a domestic economy. Two, we propose that via a judicious combination of redistributive measures and reasonable tariffs and quotas, the internal market would again become the engine of a healthy economy instead of being an appendage of an export-oriented economy. Third, we propose that voluntary participation in a plurality of economic groupings, those that allow countries to maintain policy space for development, instead of imprisoning them in a single body, the World Trade Organization, with a uniform set of rules, one that favors the interests of transnational corporations instead of the interests of their citizens. Finally, in contrast to Trump, truly bilateral negotiations should be the rule in trade relations among countries. That was the alternative we proposed a quarter of a century ago. This fluid system of international trade that allowed developing economies at least some space to pursue some growth was not unlike that of the flexible global trading system before the takeoff of globalization in the late 80s. I'm referring to the general agreements on tariffs and trade. We proposed and continue to propose a route of reasonable, rational deglobalization, one that avoids the extreme of doctrinaire, corporate-driven globalization on the one hand, and on the other, the savage unilateralism and protectionism of Trump. Now, this route to deglobalization is neither radical nor new. Keynes' words addressing the global situation in the 1980s, 30s are still very relevant to our times. And I quote, "Let goods be homespun wherever it is reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walden. And so now we're going to turn to the final closing statement by Eddie.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. You asked for a historical perspective, and of course, there are plenty of writers and commentators who've talked, as you talked, I think, about the ebbs and flows of globalization over history. There are plenty of people, for example, who will point to the period between about 1870 and 1914, the onset of the Great War in Europe, as an early example of globalization. If I'm going to join Walden in quoting from John Maynard Keynes, John Maynard Keynes wrote in, I think, looking back in about 1919, he looked back to the era before the Great War, before the First World War, and he said, it was wonderful. I could sit there in London, I could pick up my telephone and I could order products from Africa, I could order products from Asia. These were the glory days of, he didn't use the term global economy, but something to that effect. So, but, and I think there's a big but here, I'm myself wary of seeing these processes in ebbs and flows. I'm wary of any cyclical theories of history because they tend to deny the role of human agency and the decisions that people make at any particular point in time. If we look back at that era before the First World War, it was, of course, the golden age of imperialism. The British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and so on. And therefore, what globalization was taking place, if you want to use that term, it was taking place within the framework of empire. So I don't think myself that is entirely a fair comparison with today, although, of course, today's globalizing processes have been dominated by the major powers. We are, of course, moving through to a more multipolar world in which other countries are increasingly securing a place for themselves. If we were to look ahead a few decades, we are looking towards a world in which India and Indonesia will play much, much more of a role. But, I mean, let me conclude by saying that I take all the points, and I do, about the need for redistribution, the need for assistance, the need for Western governments to be much more proactive, both in terms of development assistance within their own borders and internationally. But at the same time, I am, at the end of the day, a believer in economic rationality. And economic rationality, in my book, takes us back to some of the founding fathers, and they were founding fathers of economics as a discipline. In particular, many will be familiar with the work of David Ricardo and the principles of comparative advantage. Basically, okay, Britain and Denmark, my two countries, could indeed attempt to make wine. And indeed, they have attempted to make wine on a few occasions. But on the other hand, it really isn't in their interest. They have an interest in trade and exchange, and it is trade and exchange that boosts economic growth, not just a search for efficiency, but economic growth that has, albeit very unevenly, yielded increased living standards for very significant numbers across the world. And we may obviously not want to use the same words, the same expressions, the same styles as Mr. Trump, President Trump, or Vice President Vance. But nonetheless, if we are talking about significant restrictions on trade, My fear between nations, my fear would be that that would inhibit an economic machine that, notwithstanding all its structural weaknesses, has generated much to be grateful for over the past half century.
Thank you very much. Now, first of all, I want everyone to join me in thanking the two debaters and their Walden and Eddie. If you were in this room, you would see a large number of very happy people who are, and you've stuffed them with so many good arguments that at the end of this, they're going to have to get a drink because we're going to have cocktails. We're not going to take a vote on who was the winning debater, but we will say that if we can ever get one or the other or both of you to New York, we'll be very happy to have a dinner, invite our members and board members and so forth. And you can go at it again, although we're going to put you on we're going to put you on opposite sides of the table so there won't be any physical damage. But I really, really want to thank you. And the way we'd like to end before we start those here in person, our cocktails and networking, we'd like to take the vote again. So if my colleague here could put up the QR code again, we're going to see whether people between the keynote speech and whether there's a difference in opinion. So let's see if we get some results here. Wow, there has been a shift. There has been a shift. If those who remember, we started out 66% said they disagreed and 33% said they agreed, and it has shifted. So now 56% disagree and 43%, now 44% agree. So in fact, our speakers had an impact on the audience.
Congratulations, Walden.
Congratulations to all of us.
Absolutely. So we'll let our debaters have their own personal opinions about how much influence they had, but the data speaks for itself. So with that, first of all, again, I really want to thank both of you, and I hope to see you in person sometime, and possibly in a better time zone than you're in right now. And we welcome you to be in New York. And I also, again, let's all thank our debater. And with that, our message to those people who are online, I hope you enjoyed this program. You cannot join us for cocktails here, but I encourage you to go to your liquor cabinet and abide by whatever it is that you happen to have there. And those who are here, we have drinks and hors d'oeuvres in the back.